Welcome to Abiding Creatives Podcast, where we talk about art, faith, and caring for your creative soul. I'm Haley, an artist and writer learning to faithfully follow Jesus in my creative calling. And this is the podcast for all of us makers, dreamers, and ones created to create, who are ready to let go of striving and discover the joy and freedom of creating with Jesus. Welcome back to Abiding Creatives Podcast. Today, our episode is about using creativity to connect with and know the heart of God. I'm really excited about this episode because for me, creativity has been a pathway for understanding more about God and knowing Him personally, and it's completely transformed my relationship with Him. And I hope it becomes the same for you. So before we get into the episode, I would really appreciate if you could like, share, and leave a comment on this podcast. It would mean so much to me if you could help me keep spreading this podcast to the creatives that need to hear it. Now let's get into it. One of the biggest parts of being a follower of Jesus is going on a journey of knowing Him personally. We believe that our God can be known, that He's infinite and yet also intimate, and wants us to discover more about Him, and in doing so, we learn more about ourselves as well. And there are many ways that we can go about gaining this knowledge about God, but I want to explore a couple in this episode a little deeper and how they connect to our creativity. I recently discovered the theory of knowledge and the ways of knowing, and these categorize the ways that we acquire knowledge, and they include language, sense perception, emotion, reason, imagination, faith, intuition, and memory. And I think it's interesting that these all are ways that we acquire knowledge, and as I think about how I've grown in my knowledge and understanding of God, I can see how I've used all of those ways. And I see this theory of knowledge overlapping the ways that we connect with God, the broad ones being through our mind, our heart, and our body. In some ways, we may focus on one of those more than the other. One is more dominant. This can be a personal thing in personalities, or it could be a cultural thing in the way that your church or your faith background emphasizes one over the other. But I want to explore a little bit of the history of how art and creativity has shifted in its role in the church, because I think that that can also be a clue to maybe how we have focused on one way of knowing God more than another way. In recent centuries, the Western church has emphasized knowing God through the mind, but this hasn't always been the story. In the early church and for many centuries, art and creativity was a way for people to know God, because many people couldn't read. And the church and Christians used art and beautiful buildings to express the nature of God, to tell stories about the history of the Bible, and to help people connect with Him. Coinciding with the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century, there was this shift that happened where there was more emphasis on logic and reason and intellect, and people began to be able to read more. It brought changes to the way that we help people grow in their faith and knowledge of God. The Enlightenment brought into the church a focus on logic and reason, studying and critiquing the Bible to ensure accuracy, and acquiring provable knowledge of God. And these are all important things because it brought uniformity to our collective story, helped us make discoveries that proved historical evidence of Jesus and other events that are documented in the Bible. So the Enlightenment had its good impacts, but it also de-emphasized other ways of knowing God that had been important to people in the past, and I would say it's equally important today. That being the supernatural and embracing that not everything about God is knowable through our minds, but also through our bodies, through our senses, through our emotions, and also the reality that there's just a level of mystery about God, that He is knowable. At the same time, He's so much bigger than us that we will never fully know Him this side of heaven. Many of these other ways of knowing God that they shifted away from are also connected to our creativity, our imaginations, our senses. These are the things we use when we create, and they're also ways that God can teach us about Him if we allow Him to. So let's talk about what we can learn from God as we're creating. One thing we learn about God through creativity is his character. It's one thing to read in Genesis about God creating the world, and another to partake in creation and understand what all goes into creating something. Our desire to create good and beautiful things reflects God's nature, and this can help us embrace our own unique quirks and features that he has intentionally placed in each of us as a creator. In creating, we also learn that God values bringing order out of chaos and emptiness. Anyone who stared at a blank canvas or paper knows that feeling of being unable to produce something out of nothing. And it's in those moments that we realize that God is the one that can bring something out of nothing, and he puts that creativity in us so that we then can create. We are like God, but we are not God. And so we are able to create because he puts his creative spirit in us. Through creating, we can also know God's heart for us, that he delights in all that he creates, including us, and that he's very relational. We can see this back when he invited Adam to partake in naming the animals and being a creator. So from the very beginning, creativity has always been a way that God wants us to connect with him. He gives us these creative gifts because we reflect his image, but also in hopes that we turn around and want to create with him so that he can show more of himself to us. In creating, we also get to know what God values. One thing is beauty. He loves to make things beautiful, whether it's situations or us that just feel broken and chaotic and hopeless. He never just leaves things the way they are, but is always aiming towards restoring them to beauty. Beauty also ushers us into a posture of awe and wonder, and that is a way that we connect through God, whether it is through the nature or art that we make. These are ways we can open ourselves up to knowing the creator. We also learn that God values presence over performance. The creative process can get us in touch with those parts of ourselves that are messy and imperfect, but in those we can experience the joy of God's presence, and that changes everything. Another thing we learn about God through creating is how he values hard work and discipline. When we pursue a creative practice, we have to pursue it with all of our hearts and be disciplined to learn the skills and techniques and keep showing up to the studio. We can do this knowing that God delights in us continuing to create, even when we don't see the final piece yet. It reminds me of Zechariah 4:10 that says, "Do not despise in humble beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." This always encourages me in my creative work because often I don't really know where I'm headed with it, but I can trust that God is just happy that I'm continuing it. And lastly, in creating, we can know what God thinks of us, that everything he creates is intentional, that he rejoices over everyone and everything that he creates, that we reflect his image, and that also he invites us into relationship through creativity. To sum it up, creativity can help us learn who God is and who he created us to be. For the last bit of the episode, I want to explore how God uses our art to help others know him better. Looking back at my faith journey, I can see how art has played a big role in me knowing God. I always love going to museums and seeing art that depicts different biblical scenes because it brings these scenes to life in ways that you just don't see when you're reading it on the pages of the Bible. I love productions like The Chosen that are fleshing out what it really looked like to follow Jesus during his ministry. It really just connects with our hearts and our bodies and our minds in ways that only reading the Bible or hearing a sermon can't fully grasp. And then there are the writers and musicians that have put words to the experiences that I've felt in those valleys and dark seasons where I needed someone ahead of me to bring encouragement and show that there is more to hope for. I've needed the honesty of these artists to be able to wrestle with my own struggles and confusions with God, and it helps me not feel so alone in them. I also love the artists who are using their art to creatively share their stories and testimonies, and also serving people tangibly with their gifts. It's so beautiful that we can help others connect with God through the things that we create. Something that I love doing through my creative work is finding ways to express these spiritual experiences that we all face in the twists and turns of following Jesus. For me, this has often included experiences of spiritual wilderness in the wanderings and questionings that we have when the path forward doesn't seem very clear and God feels far away or we feel empty and dry. I find a way to encourage myself and others going through that is to create art that shows there's beauty in those seasons, so that it's not always drab, that there's bright colors, that God is wanting to meet us even in those times where we feel like He's not there. And I love using desert imagery to flip the script on what we expect out of wilderness seasons. As artists, musicians, writers, and creatives of all kind, we have an incredible opportunity to use our mediums to meet people where they're at, to bring hope, joy, and encouragement on their faith journey. I want to leave you with a few questions to reflect on that I'll share in the show notes as well. Which pathway of knowledge, the heart, the mind, or the body, comes most naturally to you in knowing God? How does creating help you grow in your understanding of God and yourself? How might Jesus be inviting you to use your creativity to help others know Him? Well, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I enjoyed talking about how creativity is a way that we can know God's heart, and I hope that it encourages you to continue to grow deeper in your faith through creativity and use it to help others do the same. I look forward to our next conversation.